The summer of 1945 brought Japanese prisoners of war face to face with something more startling than defeat itself: America's abundance. Men raised to believe surrender was worse than death suddenly sat at tables piled with hamburgers, French fries, and bottles of Coca-Cola. At first, they refused to touch the strange food, suspecting poison. But what happened when they finally tasted it, and what those meals revealed about the true power of the United States, would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, honor, and the future of Japan. In the early 1940s, Japan's soldiers marched into war guided by an unshakable belief: surrender was not an option. The Bushido Code, woven into the nation's military culture, taught that capture brought shame not only on the soldier, but on his family and ancestors. Officers and enlisted men alike were drilled to prefer death to imprisonment, and the empire praised those who chose ritual suicide rather than disgrace. For countless Japanese troops, the idea of being held prisoner was unimaginable, something almost worse than execution. This cultural foundation explains why the shock of American prisoner of war camps struck them so deeply. The reality of life in the Japanese military during World War II was one of scarcity and improvisation. Rations often consisted of little more than rice balls, dried fish, or barley when supplies allowed it. More often, troops were forced to scavenge from local populations, eat what they could forage in jungles, or raid enemy stockpiles. Diseases linked to malnutrition spread rapidly. Even elite units that had captured territory across the Pacific often fought on half-empty stomach, convinced that sheer willpower and loyalty to the emperor would sustain them where food could not. On the other side of the Pacific, America was undergoing one of the most dramatic industrial mobilizations in human history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's call for an arsenal of democracy had turned automobile factories into producers of tanks, radios, and rifles. The same mass production techniques that had given rise to consumer abundance were redirected toward war. Yet, the U.S. did not only build weapons, it mass-produced food, clothing, and every necessity for soldiers spread across continents. For Americans, efficiency wasn't just about machines. It extended to how troops were fed, clothed, and housed. Japanese propaganda often described Americans as soft, indulgent, and too dependent on material comfort to endure a real struggle. To many Japanese soldiers, the idea that a nation could fight while still consuming luxuries like chocolate, cigarettes, or soda seemed absurd. But the first encounters between Japanese prisoners and American-run facilities would completely overturn this worldview. Men who had grown up in a culture of scarcity suddenly found themselves facing an enemy whose greatest weapon wasn't just the rifle or bomber, but the sheer ability to produce abundance at will. For the prisoners who would soon experience hamburgers, French fries, and Coca-Cola, the shock was not only culinary, it was existential. It revealed a profound gap between two nations, one clinging to ancient ideals of sacrifice, the other harnessing modern industry to fuel both war and leisure. And when these worlds collided in the prison camps of America, the impact would be nothing short of transformative. The first significant groups of Japanese soldiers taken prisoner by American forces came after the brutal campaigns in Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands in 1942 and 1943. These were not the weak or broken remnants of Japan's army. Many were seasoned fighters, naval aviators who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, Marines who had captured Hong Kong, and paratroopers who had marched through the Dutch East Indies. They were men who, only months earlier, had been riding a wave of victories that gave Japan dominance across the Pacific. Now, stripped of their weapons and transported across an ocean, they were confronted with an environment more shocking than any battlefield. When these men entered American custody, they braced themselves for torture, starvation, or execution. Japanese military culture had conditioned them to expect brutality from an enemy they had been told was barbaric and weak-willed. Instead, they were met with something altogether different. The prison camps they entered were not crude stockades, but organized compounds with barracks, mess halls, electricity, and running water. Some even had libraries, sports fields, and cinemas. For men who had marched barefoot through jungles or slept in caves to avoid bombardments, the sight of structured facilities that functioned like small towns was bewildering. One former prisoner, Yukio Matsumoto, described his disbelief at the medical treatment he received upon capture. American doctors dressed his wounds with sealed bandages, antiseptics, and gleaming instruments, supplies he had never seen in Japan, where even military hospitals suffered crippling shortages. To him, it seemed as though the Americans had an endless stock of everything. What struck him most was not just the quality of the care, but the sheer volume of materials available. The astonishment only deepened when food was introduced. Instead of scraps or thin rice gruel, prisoners were offered white bread that was soft and sweet compared to the coarse grains of home, along with canned meats and processed cheese. But nothing shocked them more than the casual introduction of Coca-Cola. Sweet, fizzy, and ice-cold, it was unlike anything they had ever tasted. To Japanese prisoners, accustomed to seeing sugar as a rare luxury, this was more than a drink. It was evidence of a system that could prioritize pleasure in the middle of a world war. At first, many prisoners refused to touch these strange meals, convinced they must be poisoned or part of some sinister trick. But hunger eventually eroded suspicion. Slowly, they began to sample the offerings, and their reactions ranged from wonder to disbelief. The salty indulgence of hamburgers, the crisp satisfaction of fries, and the dizzying sweetness of soda were unlike anything from their homeland. More than a matter of taste, these meals carried a deeper message. America had so much that even its prisoners ate better than Japanese soldiers in the field. What began as culture shock soon became a revelation. These first encounters with American abundance forced Japanese prisoners to confront an unsettling truth. They had been fighting an enemy whose strength did not rest solely on courage or weapons, but on a vast industrial machine that could provide both comfort and victory. And the deeper they looked into life inside those camps, the clearer it became that their entire understanding of the war and of power itself had been incomplete. By 1943, American prison camps across the continental United States had begun receiving thousands of Japanese prisoners. For many of them, the daily meals became their most vivid memory of captivity, not because of hunger, but because of the overwhelming abundance. American rations didn't just provide nutrition, they delivered variety, convenience, and even pleasure. Prisoners accustomed to carefully portioned rice and occasional fish now encountered trays filled with canned meats, processed cheese, vegetables sealed in tins, and white bread so soft it seemed unreal. But nothing symbolized the gulf between the two nations like hamburgers and Coca-Cola. The hamburger was a uniquely American creation, born from assembly line thinking. Ground beef was pressed into patties, layered with mass-produced buns, and topped with cheese, ketchup, and pickles that tasted exotic to Japanese palates. The French fries that came alongside them, uniformly cut, fried golden, and salted, showed the precision of American food production on a massive scale. And then came the Coca-Cola, cold, sweet, and fizzy, a drink that existed for no reason other than enjoyment. For men who had spent years fighting and starving in tropical jungles, the idea of an enemy who could waste resources on pleasure beverages was astonishing. At first, suspicion dominated. Many prisoners hesitated to eat, fearing that the strange food was poisoned, or that accepting American generosity would stain their honor. But hunger is a powerful persuader, and gradually, the meals were accepted. What followed was something like a cultural awakening. Prisoners began to whisper to one another about the taste of the hamburger, salty, greasy, and satisfying in ways rice could not replicate. They marveled at the way Coca-Cola seemed to lift their spirits, almost addictive in its sugary rush. Behind these foods lay something deeper than flavor. To the prisoners, every bite symbolized American power. The United States not only armed its soldiers with rifles and tanks, but also supplied them with luxuries in the middle of a global war. To see hamburgers and Coke handed out casually in prison camps drove home a chilling reality. The industrial machine behind these foods could just as easily produce warplanes, bombs, and ships at rates Japan could never match. The simple act of eating fast food became an education in what abundance really meant. The environment of American prison camps only amplified the lessons taught by hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Facilities like Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, and Camp Livingston in Louisiana were not hastily constructed enclosures. They were fully functioning miniature cities, designed with the same industrial precision that characterized every American wartime effort. Each camp contained rows of standardized barracks, medical clinics with ample supplies, mess halls that could serve thousands at a time, and even recreational areas with sports fields, libraries, and theaters. Electricity flowed reliably. Water treatment plants provided clean drinking water. Trucks rolled in daily carrying fresh food, clothing, and medical equipment. To Japanese prisoners, many of whom had served in units where resupply was sporadic and improvisation was constant, this level of organization was almost beyond comprehension. What shocked them most was the casual waste. Guards would toss half-eaten sandwiches into bins, pour unfinished coffee onto the ground, or discard broken packaging without hesitation. For men who had been taught to save every scrap of food and reuse even the smallest piece of twine, the sight of such excess was both painful and revelatory. Some prisoners secretly gathered discarded bottles, napkins, and wrappers, not out of rebellion, but because they couldn't comprehend letting useful items go to waste. Even the kitchens themselves became a source of fascination. Japanese prisoners assigned to labor duties saw vast quantities of food arrive daily: sides of beef, giant cans of vegetables, barrels of flour, crates of eggs. The equipment, industrial mixers, enormous ovens, refrigerated storage, looked like something from another world for prisoners who had cooked over open fires or eaten raw roots in the jungle. These kitchens embodied an entirely different way of thinking about sustenance. To the Americans, this abundance was simply standard procedure, a byproduct of efficiency. But to their captives, it was a living demonstration that America's power wasn't only military, it was logistical, industrial, and cultural. The camps became classrooms where Japanese soldiers learned, often reluctantly, that their enemy's greatest weapon wasn't the atom bomb or the aircraft carrier. It was the ability to feed, clothe, and sustain not only armies, but even their prisoners with a consistency and scale that Japan could never dream of achieving. By 1944, one particular product began to stand out above all others as the ultimate symbol of American power: Coca-Cola. To American soldiers, it was nothing more than a refreshing drink, a piece of home in a glass bottle. To Japanese prisoners, it seemed like sorcery. Here was a carbonated liquid, sweet, fizzy, and cold, arriving in neat glass bottles with identical labels and caps, even in the middle of a prisoner of war camp, thousands of miles from the factories that produced it. For men who had grown up in a culture where luxury meant a seasonal fruit or a rare cut of fish, the very existence of such a drink was disorienting. They couldn't comprehend how a beverage that served no nutritional purpose could be produced and distributed so widely. During wartime, the idea that the United States could spare fuel, glass, sugar, and manpower to deliver Coke to both soldiers and their prisoners suggested an industrial and logistical power so far beyond Japan's reach that it felt almost supernatural. Some prisoners described their first sip as a revelation. The sweet rush of sugar, the sharp sting of carbonation, and the icy chill of the bottle created sensations they had never experienced. Many became quietly obsessed, trading favors for an extra bottle when they could. Others marveled not only at the taste, but at what it represented: a system capable of producing millions of identical bottles every day and distributing them with flawless precision to the farthest corners of the earth. What the prisoners were experiencing, often without realizing it, was America's consumer culture. The same industrial logic that made Coca-Cola possible also made mass production of aircraft, tanks, and ships possible. The ability to standardize, replicate, and distribute on a global scale was the true engine behind America's war effort. Each bottle of Coke was more than a drink. It was a demonstration of how an enemy could project power not just with weapons, but with comfort, abundance, and pleasure. The symbolism wasn't lost on American planners honors either. Coca-Cola had been designated a war essential by Roosevelt, with bottling plants built near bases across the world. The Japanese POWs drinking their first Cokes weren't just tasting soda. They were tasting America's industrial philosophy, distilled into something so simple yet so profound that it left them wondering how Japan could ever compete with such a force. If Coca-Cola shocked the prisoners with its novelty, what truly crushed their spirits was the sheer waste they witnessed every day. In Japanese culture, particularly during the long years of war, every resource was precious. Families saved and reused scraps of paper, bits of cloth, or tiny fragments of metal. Soldiers on the front line often survived on meager rations, sometimes eating weeds or bark when supplies ran dry. To waste food was unthinkable. It was dishonorable. In American prison camps, however, waste seemed casual and constant. Guards would toss away half-eaten hamburgers or pour unfinished coffee onto the dirt without hesitation. Prisoners watched in stunned silence as perfectly good food disappeared into trash bins, while they themselves had once fought over a handful of rice. Even small things, like the crumpling of a paper wrapper after just one use, sent waves of disbelief through men who had been raised to treasure every item. Some POWs secretly salvaged these discarded items, folding napkins, saving empty bottles, or collecting wood scraps. To the guards, it seemed harmless, even amusing, but to the prisoners, it was a reminder of how vast the gulf truly was between their world and America's. The United States had so much that it could afford to waste. Japan had so little that survival depended on saving everything. This contrast cut deeper than humiliation. It forced many Japanese soldiers to reevaluate everything they had been told about their enemy. They had been raised to believe Americans were soft and weak, corrupted by luxury. Yet in the camps, that very luxury was revealed as strength. America's abundance wasn't weakness. It was the ultimate form of power. It showed that a nation could fight a world war on two oceans and still feed its prisoners better than Japan could feed its own civilians. The psychological weight of this realization was immense. For many prisoners, the war was already lost, not because of bombs or bullets, but because they had seen with their own eyes the true scale of American resources. The hamburgers, the Coca-Cola, the casual waste, the effortless abundance, all of it told a story more devastating than any battlefield defeat. It revealed that Japan had entered a war it could never hope to win. By mid-1945, word of devastation filtered into American prison camps. POWs learned of B-29 firebombing raids that had reduced Japanese cities to ashes, of naval blockades choking off supplies, and finally of the atomic bombs that obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet for many prisoners, these reports only confirmed what they had already realized through daily life behind barbed wire, that Japan was fighting a war it could never sustain. The abundance they witnessed each day in camp wasn't just about hamburgers, fries, or bottles of Coke. It was about systems. An endless stream of trucks delivering fresh food, medical supplies arriving like clockwork, uniforms replaced without hesitation, even entertainment provided regularly to men who were technically enemies. For Japanese soldiers raised in a culture where logistics were improvisational at best, this level of organization was staggering. Their pre-war indoctrination had painted Americans as decadent and fragile, a people who could never endure true hardship, but captivity revealed a harsher truth. The supposed softness of American culture was actually a reflection of its strength, the ability to produce in excess, to distribute with efficiency, to waste without consequence. This was not weakness, but a form of power that Japan's rigid, resource-strapped society could never replicate. Letters written after the war by former POWs often captured the same haunting realization that the food they were served in captivity was better than what their own soldiers and even families had received at home. Some describe this as the moment their faith in Japan's military leadership finally broke. If their enemy could afford to treat prisoners better, then Japan could treat its own. What hope had there ever been for victory? The psychological collapse was profound. Honor codes that had once insisted death was preferable to surrender began to unravel. Men who had once thought of themselves as warriors in an eternal struggle now saw themselves as pawns, sacrificed by a nation that had failed to match America's industrial reality. The taste of a hamburger or a sip of Coca-Cola became more than just food. It became a symbol of a shattered worldview. On August 15, 1945, the unthinkable happened. Japanese prisoners huddled around radios in American camps as Emperor Hirohito's trembling voice announced surrender. For men who had been taught that their leader was divine, it was a moment of cultural collapse as much as military defeat. Many wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. But alongside the grief came a new awareness. The daily abundance they had witnessed in captivity had not been an illusion. It had been a glimpse of the world that had defeated them. The days that followed brought surprising gestures of humanity. American guards, many of whom had lost brothers and friends in the Pacific, began sharing more openly with their captives. Meals were no longer tense, obligatory encounters, but shared experiences. Some prisoners were taught how to cook hamburgers or even run the ice cream machines in the mess halls. Cultural barriers that had once seemed insurmountable began to dissolve over something as simple as food. As prisoners were processed for repatriation, the efficiency of the American system revealed itself once more. Former enemies received medical checkups, clean clothing, and standardized meals before boarding ships home. Many were even given care packages for the journey: chocolate, canned food, cigarettes, and, almost inevitably, bottles of Coca-Cola. For men returning to a homeland in ruins, these tokens of abundance were bittersweet reminders of everything they had witnessed in captivity. When the ships carrying POWs approached Japan, the contrast was overwhelming. Cities lay in smoldering ruins, harbors clogged with wreckage, industrial districts flattened by bombing. Compared to the bustling American camps with their seemingly endless supplies, Japan now looked like a relic of another age. For many returning soldiers, the realization was unavoidable. Their country's old path of sacrifice and scarcity had led only to ruin. Yet hidden within that despair was the seed of transformation. The prisoners who had once stared in disbelief at Hamburgers and Coca-Cola would return home with memories of abundance and efficiency that Japan itself would soon embrace. In time, those lessons would help fuel Japan's post-war economic miracle, as the nation rebuilt itself into a modern power shaped in part by what its defeated soldiers had first tasted in American captivity.